Morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you and Professor Fukuyama today. This is Ahmet Kuru, Portuguese Professor of Political Science here at San Diego State University. This webinar is part of a series generously funded by Portuguese Endowment. The previous webinar was with Daran Acemoğlu. And today, Professor Fukuyama is going to talk about the global rise of right-wing populism and the future of liberalism. And we are very happy to have him. And with his participation, now we have over 650 people registered from all around the world. So let me very briefly provide you a bio of Professor Fukuyama, who is a professor of political science at Stanford and the director of Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Professor Fukuyama's 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, was translated in about 20 languages. And then 10 years later, he published another major book, Trust, the Social Virtues and the Creation of Prosperity. And more recent works include two major volumes, one entitled The Origins of Political Order, from the very beginning of humanity to the French Revolution. Then the second volume, Political Order and Political Decay, from the Industrial Revolution to the present. A more recent book of Professor Fukuyama is Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politic of Resentment. So after his talk, there will be a Q&A session. You can use the Q&A tool to write down and type your questions. No chat, please. So without overdue, the virtual floor is yours, Professor Fukuyama.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kuru. I'm really very honored to be invited to speak in this series. And I want to talk about the state of global politics, and particularly the state of liberal democracy around the world, because I think that we're undergoing a major setback in democratic practice that is leading to, I think, an important possible turning point in our history. The background to this is what Professor Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. Back in the early 1970s, there were perhaps 30, 35 countries around the world that would qualify as liberal democracies. But after the wave of democratization got going in Spain and Portugal and Turkey back then, military regimes stepped aside in favor of elected governments, and the number of democracies began to expand dramatically. The most remarkable increase came after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when a number of communist countries became democracies, joined the European Union, and the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, fell apart. And so the number rose to maybe 115, 120 countries around the world. However, since approximately the time of the global financial crisis in 2008, we have been in what my colleague Larry Diamond labels a democratic recession, which is now threatening to turn into a full-scale depression. Freedom House, which ranks democracy and civil liberties around the world in its annual Freedom of the World reports, just issued its latest report for the year 2020. It chronicles a 15-year steady decline in the aggregate democracy scores of countries around the world. And in this report, it was quite remarkable that some of the biggest declines occurred in two of the world's largest and most important democracies, the United States and India. India, in fact, under Prime Minister Modi, is no longer ranked as a free country, but as a partly free country. And this reflects, quite a number of negative developments that have been going on. One is geopolitical. You now have big authoritarian countries, in particular Russia and China, that have consolidated their rule and are increasingly willing to project power and influence beyond their borders. China, I believe, in the long run is going to be the single biggest challenge to a liberal world order because it's mastered modern technology, is economically very powerful, and may at some point actually outstrip the United States, not just in total GDP, but will catch up to it in terms of per capita as well. But the subject I want to focus on is the rise of global populism, because over the last few years, a much more insidious threat has occurred right in the heart of existing liberal democracies, which is the rise of politicians who are democratically elected, but then proceed to attack and in many cases undermine the liberal institutions that characterize a true liberal democracy. So as I probably don't need to tell an academic audience, a liberal democracy is actually the union of at least two disparate institutions. The first are the democratic ones, strictly speaking, free and fair multi-party elections that allow leaders to be chosen and held accountable by broad populations. The liberal part of liberal democracy has to do with the rule of law, a constitutional structure that limits executive power and puts constraints on the way that even a democratically elected uh, executive is able to exercise power. And in many countries with rising populist movements, um, it's really that liberal part rather than the democratic part that's been challenged. So in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, in India, in the United States, you have leaders that have come to power, having won elections and receiving a democratic mandate, and have begun to attack or undermine liberal institutions. Now, the term populism is used to encompass this phenomenon. We need to do a little bit of definitional work. Populism generally refers to a movement that regards itself rooted in the people, in a broad democratic population, um, but believes that elites have been manipulating institutions and information and politics in ways that benefit themselves at the expense of ordinary people. Uh, there are other characteristics, I think, of populist governments. They tend to be led by charismatic leaders who claim a mandate from the people that is very anti-institutional, because they say after being elected, I represent the people, therefore, if you stand in the way of what I want to do, you are obstructing the people's will. And so they use democratic legitimacy to attack the check and balance institutions. And those include things like an independent judiciary and courts. It includes independent media. It includes a bureaucracy that is supposed to be impartial. And this is a process that has been ongoing now for quite a number of years. In Hungary, under Viktor Orban, the Fidesz party has packed the courts. It's basically gotten control of all of the mainstream media outlets. It's been able to use that power to gerrymander electoral districts to help keep itself in power and the like. And similar things have been going on in Poland, in India. Um, India is an unbelievably diverse and complex society that has been governed by largely liberal rules ever since its founding in the 1940s. But Narendra Modi has been seeking to shift that national identity to one based on Hinduism, which of course is extremely problematic for the almost 200 million Indians who are Muslim. And then finally, you get to our former President Donald Trump, who spent most of his 4 years trying to attack various American institutions, the intelligence community, the Justice Department, his own Attorney General, mainstream media that he said were enemies of the American people. And then finally, in what I think was probably the worst violation of democratic principles, he attacked his own democratic electoral system with his claims of fraud in the November 3rd election, thereby undermining belief in the fundamental legitimacy of the American political system in the eyes of tens of millions of his followers. And so these are some of the consequences for democratic politics of the rise of populism. By the way, there are populisms of the left as well that would be represented by, let's say, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, which is the kind of populism that had been more familiar with, which is a left-wing populism that seeks basically dramatic, radical economic redistribution. And that form exists in other countries as well. But I think what's more troubling is this right-wing version that defines the people oftentimes not as the entire population of a society, but rather a certain part of it that are somehow more the people than others in ways that are typically defined by things like ethnicity. So, for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary has explicitly said that Hungarian national identity should be based on Hungarian ethnicity, which is essentially the argument that that the National Socialists made in Germany in the 1930s, that said that a German was a certain kind of racial or ethnic type that therefore excludes people that are not of that ethnicity. And in this country, in the United States, we've seen the rise of a kind of ethno-nationalism that many of us thought had been defeated after the civil rights era in the 1960s, where national identity was more linked to allegiance to democratic institutions rather than to a particular skin color or religion or other ascriptive marker. So this is, I think, the challenge that we are facing. And the question is, what are the origins of this? Why is this occurring now? And then, we can get into some questions about what to do about this. I think that there are three categories of explanations that have been put forward. And the big debate really, I think, is between two of those categories, whether this is fundamentally an economic phenomenon or a cultural phenomenon. And I think that, as in most aspects of social behavior, it's a multi-causal development that defies a simple explanation. All of these causes are to some extent valid, but I do think that the cultural ones are really ultimately determinative of the rise of right-wing, populist nationalism. Now, let's just begin with the economic factors, which I think they may not explain why populism exists in the form it does, but I do think that they may explain something about the timing. We have been going through a 40, 50-year period of the construction of a liberal world order. These are the economic and political structures that have promoted free trade, movement of people between countries, all abetted by technology that has made transfers of information, goods, and services extraordinarily fast and easy. In fact, that container ship that that got stuck in the Suez Canal is actually a symbol of that because seaborne transport is one of the things that has facilitated the incredible volumes of trade these days and the interdependence of the world. And that's a in large measure a technological achievement that's made those shipping costs as low as they are, despite accidents like the one that happened last week. Now, if you take your typical trade theory course, you'll find that economists really like free trade because it maximizes aggregate output for everybody involved. And that's true. And so the world has gotten richer than it's ever been in this period of globalization. Global output between 1970 and well, let's say the first decade of the 2000s quadrupled. And many countries like China and India have turned into extremely fast growing societies. Many people have been, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty and so forth. The economic theory, however, if you listen carefully, will tell you that not every individual in every society has their welfare improved. And in particular, trade has undercut the incomes of a lot of working class people in rich countries who find that their jobs can be done equally well by similarly skilled people in developing countries. And this is, in fact, what happened. This well-known and often cited study by David Autor at MIT, it suggested that China's entry into the WTO in the early 2000s led to the loss of, more than 2 million American jobs. And so it's caused a social disruption. And it seemed that part of the populist upsurge was driven by a kind of delayed reaction in a way to the 2008 crisis, because the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, it was a typical product of our globalized world, that it was really created by the elites that created the modern financial system. Those elites managed to protect themselves, but millions of Americans, ordinary Americans, lost their homes as a result of it. And it's not surprising that the accumulation of these reverses has led to a great deal of unhappiness. And so, as I said, I think this may explain the timing, but it really doesn't explain the right-wing nature of what's happened, because if the fundamental problem was inequality, you would think that it would be the Bernie Sanders of the world and not the Donald Trumps that would have benefited. That is to say, the traditional left wants to do economic redistribution. They want to use the state to spend a lot of money to protect ordinary workers, to tax the rich and so forth. And yet, they're not the ones that did tremendously well in the wake of the financial crisis. It was really right-wing groups that managed to capture the momentum. And then if you look further at some of the details of what's happened politically, let's say in the United States, the average Trump voter in 2016 had a higher per capita income than the American average as a whole. And so while some of them may have been working class, laid off steel workers and auto workers, the great majority of Trump voters were actually not in that category, were not particularly economically disadvantaged. And that makes you suspect that the causes are more complex psychologically and sociologically. And I think that there's been a tremendous amount of analysis put into this in the years since 2016, and there's several interesting results that the fundamental source of polarization in the United States is correlated the most strongly with actually geography. That is to say, people that vote for liberal policies and politicians, people in the United States that vote Democratic, tend to live in big urban agglomerations. So that's, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and the like. Whereas conservative voters tend to live in second and third tier cities and towns in the countryside, and so forth. And what's interesting is that this is a global phenomenon. So, even in Professor Kuru's country in Turkey, Mr. Erdogan is not all that popular in Ankara and Istanbul. His base of support really exists in outside of those big urban areas. That's true of Orban in Hungary. He's not popular in Budapest. Um, in Poland, you have a very similar division between urban, more cosmopolitan, better educated Poles and others that have not been able to benefit from, let's say, the integration into the EU the way urban dwellers have. And I think that those geographical divisions reflect a cultural division between people who have accepted, many different forms of diversity and those that are made uncomfortable by it. But it, the specific way this plays out really is very context specific, and it's not really the same in the United States as it is in parts of Europe or in Brazil or in other places where this has happened. In the United States, a lot of that division uh, is one where race, I think, plays an important role. If you look at this, and there's been a tremendous amount written about polarization and why you've had the rise of this uh, populist nationalist takeover of the Republican Party and the shift in the conservative agenda here. I think a lot of it does actually start with the great realignment that happened in the 1960s after the civil rights movement succeeded in passage of basic civil rights legislation. At that point, the Democratic Party was a heterogeneous collection of urban intellectuals and Catholic working class voters and a lot of African Americans, but also a lot of white segregationists in the South. And the Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights led a lot of those white voters to leave the Democratic Party and shift over to the point where basically Democrats who used to control the politics on both the state and national level in the old Confederacy have now become almost completely uniformly Republican. And that has uh, the intensity of some of the fears and resentments that caused, I think were accelerated when our first Black president, President Obama, was elected. And that set things off in, I think, a very unfortunate and negative direction. However, I think it's also important to recognize that in the United States, as in other areas with populist resentments, it's not just about race or ethnicity. There's also a big cultural element. And here I think that there's more legitimacy to some of the anger and resentment that is felt by more conservative voters because, I think it is a tendency of educated cosmopolitan people to look down on people that are not like themselves. And here the issue is the one that I wrote about in my book Identity. It's driven by a fundamental demand for dignity and the desire for respect, which I think is crucial to human psychology. And that lack of respect, I think, has been intensely felt by a lot of conservative voters, many of whom actually are not particularly racist, certainly not in their behavior, and resent liberals that then tell them that that's what's really driving them. There's somehow secret racism. The other thing that I would say in general is that the nature of global politics has been shifting in this identity direction away from economic divisions pretty steadily over the last couple of decades. Um, in the 20th century, the big political divisions were really defined by differences in economic ideology. Between a left that wanted a lot of redistribution or some kind of democratic socialism, if not socialism itself, and a right that wanted free markets, economic liberty, and the like. And that's increasingly been shifting to an identity-based division. And actually, in the United States, this really began in the 1960s on the left rather than on the right, where both the Democratic Party and progressives in general began to see inequality not so much in terms of a broad class like the proletariat, which was, Marx's understanding of, the underdogs, but rather in terms of racial minorities, women, um, gays and lesbians, other groups that had been socially and economically marginalized. And in fact, the old working class that had been the basis of the support for left-wing parties, both in the United States and in Europe, increasingly lost touch as they began this redefinition in terms of these narrower identities. Uh, they began to lose touch with their old base of working class supporters. So, early, new left thinker like Herbert Marcuse actually began to accuse working class voters of essentially wanting to perpetuate a system of privilege. And that, in turn, I think reinforced the move towards identity on the right. So today you find a lot of, let's say, white nationalists or alt-right advocates that are using exactly the same language of identity that people on the left have been using. That is to say, we are the victims of racism. This time it's anti-white racism. Uh, we are a marginalized minority who have lost control over, our futures because of this conspiracy between minority groups and white elites to hold us down. And that I think has been fueling. Okay, I'm getting towards the end of my time, so I better I better wrap up with one really important point, and that has to do with the nature of technology and information, because I think that the older consensus around liberal values and institutions was, in fact, supported by a certain cognitive structure in which you had hierarchical institutions that could control the flow of what was regarded as credible institutions. So you think back to when I was growing up, you had three over-the-air broadcast channels. You had a few big newspapers, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and so forth, that pretty much served as filters for what people regarded as credible information. And the much greater consensus over politics that existed then was, I think, in large measure a byproduct of that kind of channeling of information through those institutions. The internet destroyed all of this. I think that people point to social media in particular, but I think it's much broader than that because technology, first created this proliferation, let's say, of AM radio, where a lot of conservatives in the 1980s discovered that they also had different views that were outside of the mainstream consensus, and that was a technology they use. The internet itself became a place where people could host very different points of view, and then social media sort of capped that off by providing big megaphones for a whole variety of voices, which at this point have really undermined the idea that you actually have a common base of factual information. And I think the situation that the United States is in today is emblematic of that, where you have a substantial part of the American electorate that believes that the November 3rd election was stolen, and um, another larger group that thinks that it was actually a very free and fair election. And it's very hard to see how you have reasonable democratic deliberation when the factual basis of the problems that the society is confronting is as contested as that. And so this, of course, is an issue that occurs around the world. We used to believe that the internet would be supportive of democracy because it would democratize access to information. That is true in many societies, but many authoritarian countries like China have figured out how to essentially control the internet and use it for its own propaganda purposes, and in fact to use something like their social credit system to monitor the minute day-to-day behavior of their own population. Russia has taken a slightly different approach where it's weaponized the internet and used it not to promote a particular point of view, but basically simply to erode trust that Western publics had in their own governing institutions. And around the world, it's been a tool that's been used by many enemies of democracy. And so that technological shift, I think, has also been quite important in contributing to the erosion of what had been under the third wave a broader consensus about the appeal and the legitimacy of democracy. I don't want to say at this point too much about what you do about this. Part of the reason for this is I don't know the answer to that because these are very complex problems. They have many different sources, and therefore an agenda for dealing with these kinds of issues is going to be a very complex one. But I'm happy to, in the Q&A, talk about ways forward that might, they may not solve the problem, but they may mitigate some of the challenges that modern liberal democracies are facing. So with that, let me stop talking, and I look forward to any questions or discussion that I may have provoked. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama, for this thought-provoking and very insightful speech, and I really appreciate your insights. So now for the audience, it's time to type and write down your questions using the Q&A and tool. There are already 20 questions. I will read some of them. Of course, we can read all of them, but please write whatever questions you have. We are reading all of them and asking many to Professor Fukuyama. I want to start with my own questions, which is that you are one of the very rare scholars and intellectuals who are dealing with big questions. And each of your book is really addressing big questions with philosophical and very much ideational depth and analysis. But today, there are two main challenges to such scholarship. One is coming very broad idea of an emphasis on technical education, data science, and the idea that people can just learn politics from social media and earn money from other professions. And there is some decline in liberal arts education and social science majors. But there is also an internal challenge coming in our discipline, political science in particular and social science in general, with an emphasis on rational choice theory, statistics, and as people, as scholars and intellectuals who really appreciate big questions, how can we address these challenges? Do you see more people like yourself in the near future, young intellectuals and scholars writing books, or we are going to lose this very important insight?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not anticipating a real shift. The reasons why young academics focus on narrow questions is, I think, really the control that the academic disciplines hold over younger academics. And I've actually thought that this is related also to the tenure system, because if you look at the incentives facing any young academic, tenure is so valuable that they will do whatever the discipline demands. And the way tenure is rewarded is that you meet the standards. And generally speaking, this is the methodological standards that are created not by your discipline in general, but by the sub part of your discipline that you are focusing on. So whether that in political science, that's comparative politics or international relations or the like. And that tends to make people very narrow, and it also disables them from being able to communicate with larger audiences because they tend to adopt, the kind of jargon and technical terminology of those people that will be awarding them tenure, which makes them incapable of speaking, to broader audiences. Part of this, I think, was due to the broad impact of economics, because economics had set itself up as the only social science that had a possibility of rivaling, a natural science, and therefore became very, very mathematical and abstract. I think that period is probably ending. But I must say there's another big problem, which is in the humanities themselves. You've got a very different sort of problem where, with the rise of critical theory and a kind of academic version of identity politics, it also became very difficult to talk about a certain set of issues that were related to, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and the like. I'm actually just completing a book, which is a defense of classical liberalism, where I try to go through some of these trends, both, economic trends on the right and identity politics trends on the left. And I think that the combination of the two of those has made it difficult for people to do what you've just suggested, which is to address, really big, important issues in a way that would actually inform a public debate as opposed to, satisfying these much narrower academic audiences.
Thank you very much. So we have one question from Pakistan by Farah Adid. He says, as you know, liberal democracy is facing an unprecedented challenge in the face of far-right movements, including Western countries, and referring to French President Macron and his speech about Islam and blaming that or what he calls radical Islam for promoting anti-modernity. So, and it's a very long question. Let me summarize that this student intellectual from Pakistan is asking whether Islamophobia now is becoming an important dimension of right-wing populism in Western Europe and to some extent in the United States. Do you see that it will continue like that in the near future?
Well, Islamophobia, yes, has been a feature of right-wing populism for as long as there's been, these more radical, well, especially since September 11th, which is really the event that focused people's attention on it. How to judge someone like President Macron's response, I think, is a little bit more complicated because, the Islamic world is itself very diverse, and there are, in fact, extremely illiberal forms of Islamism that do represent, I think, a pretty serious threat to liberal practice and to democratic practice, more to liberal practice than to democracy. But I think that threat exists, and so you actually want, a response that is appropriate to that degree of threat. Islamophobia, I think, is dangerous when it's not applied to people that are real enemies of, modern liberal practice, but to kind of ordinary people who regard Islam as part of their cultural heritage, who, just want to enjoy a kind of traditional kind of religiosity or cultural practice that they grew up with. And to the extent that that is seen as threatening or somehow unpatriotic, I think is a very bad thing. And so it depends really on making these kinds of distinctions, because you want a response that's appropriate to, the real problem that exists.
Thank you. So one question from Cheryl O'Brien, who is a professor of political science here at San Diego State University. Trump voters had significantly lower education level that I read in scholarship. How does that fit with the psychology of the far right? Does that explain some of the falling for misinformation?
I don't think that actually the overall level of education correlates very much with people's political attitudes. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has written a really interesting and I think insightful book, The Righteous Mind, in which he talks about the phenomenon of motivated reasoning. And he actually cites some studies that show that more educated people oftentimes go in for more radical types of opinions than their less educated peers, precisely because they're educated and knowledgeable and smart. And I think that the argument is that the standard kind of rational choice model where people observe the objective reality around them, take in empirical information, analyze it, come up with causal models, and then form preferences based on those is wrong. It puts things backwards, that they actually start with preferences and they use their cognitive abilities to come up with evidence and arguments that support those preferences. And that's why, strong partisans are actually oftentimes extremely well educated. We have a professor in the education school at Stanford, Sam Weinberg, that's done these kind of remarkable studies of Stanford students who are, obviously pretty bright people, but they don't know how to interpret information they see on the internet. They don't know how to actually understand what's a credible online source of information or not. And it really doesn't have to do with their overall education. It does more have to do with political preferences, and then the fact that we don't actually train people in how to deal with the internet and how to recognize credible sources or not. And this is why I think that, one of the policy solutions that people had put forward is say, well, we just need better general education, more people going to college and so forth. And I actually think that that may be a desirable thing in itself, right? I mean, there's lots of economic reasons why you would want a more broadly educated population. But first of all, it isn't going to happen on a universal basis. I mean, it's still the case in the United States that about only 30% of people actually graduate from a four-year university. And secondly, it's not clear that it would solve the particular populist, voter problem. And therefore, I think you're going to have to look for other kinds of solutions.
Thank you. One question from Turkey, Tarık Çelenk, asking about the relationship between the post-COVID world and the right-wing populism. So there are several questions about that. And if I sum up, yes, in the US, Trump lost the election, but does that mean that will be the decline? And how do you see the post-COVID world and right-wing
Yeah,
populism?
no, that's right. I actually have a whole separate lecture just on that topic because, I've written some about what COVID tells you about different governance systems. And actually, I have to say at this point that, I wrote an article on this in Foreign Affairs last summer, in which I thought I understood why certain countries were doing well and others not. And I must say that I'm more confused about that today than I was back then because things have changed very dramatically. But there are some, I think, conclusions that you can come to. So one of them is that COVID has been very bad for democratic politics around the world. Many countries have used the epidemic and the health crisis as an excuse to increase executive authorities. One of the first things that Viktor Orban did in Hungary once the epidemic hit was to have his parliament grant him emergency powers. And the first thing he used those emergency powers to do was to change some rules on gay marriage, had nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. And that's happened in many places, in El Salvador, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in China. I think that China probably would not have extended its security law to Hong Kong had it not been for COVID. But I think they believed that because of the epidemic, other countries were preoccupied with health, and they would not make a big fuss about their basically swallowing Hong Kong. So that's been bad, and I think the real test is going to be whether any of these leaders are going to give back those powers, those emergency powers, once the crisis subsides. And I think my guess is that most of them will not. Um, so then it's going to be a matter of struggle between, I think populations that are unhappy with their governments have been unable to protest because of the epidemic, uh, but may, get back out on the streets. It has discredited certain kinds of populist leaders. I really think that if the epidemic had not occurred, Donald Trump could easily have won a second term in office. I think it's rapidly undermining Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Brazil's performance in the epidemic has been absolutely uh, disastrous. You just saw the resignation of all of his service chiefs in the military that had been backers of his previously. So it's not good for him. I think it's hurting the reputation of a left-wing populist, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico, who similarly has had a very poor reaction, public policy reaction to the COVID epidemic. So there may be actually some good sides to this, but overall it's been a negative for democracy.
Thank you. So one question by Peter Gorovich. In looking at demands, we should look as well at the elite responses. How would you evaluate comparatively why the elite in the United States has been so resistant to greater economic support in welfare state measures like taxes and healthcare, in comparison to Scandinavian and other European elites seem quite willing to accept fair share? Does this have does that have an impact on whether populist resentment go toward the left or the right in these cases?
Um, well, there are many reasons why the United States has had a smaller welfare state than other developed democracies. This is something that one of my mentors, Seymour Martin Lipset, wrote about when he talked about American exceptionalism, that part of American political culture has really been the strong anti-statism that doesn't exist in most of Europe, doesn't exist in Japan or Korea, many other democracies, but is very powerful in the United States. It's a kind of inbuilt hostility to government. But that hasn't been determinative, because in the progressive era and then in the New Deal, you saw a big expansion of American state authority. So even in the United States, people saw government as an appropriate response. I think that in recent years, you had this upsurge of neoliberalism, which I would say was a much more extreme form of anti-statism, pro-market economic ideology that began in the late 70s and early 80s with the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, supported, by the Chicago School of Economics and a lot of highbrow intellectuals that provided justifications for cutting back the state. And that now is in the process of itself being reversed. So I think that the policies that Biden has introduced with the stimulus bill and his plans for further, deficit spending for infrastructure signal another big shift in which people are more willing to trust government. And by the way, this isn't just a thing on the left. I think the stimulus bill actually has got a lot of support, from people on the right who have now broken with the old kind of austerity
Professor Fukuyama, are you with us?
Yeah.
Okay,
Can you
there
hear me?
was, yeah, we can hear you now. There was just
Yeah.
some seconds of connection problem.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, all I was saying was there's been a pendulum swinging towards more state and less state, and we're coming out of the swing towards less state and, probably back into more state at this point.
Thank you. So there's one question from India, Rumat Kumar Ratha. It's about the Chinese economic growth and whether it can be a challenge to the notion of liberal democracy. It's a long question, but basically asking whether when people see China is growing under authoritarianism, does that become a major challenge to the idea of liberal democracy, that it is not necessary, it is inefficient, you can have economic growth with authoritarianism?
Yes, it's definitely a challenge. One of the assumptions that liberals like myself have made is that ultimately innovation and growth requires a degree of political freedom, that if people don't have the ability to buy and sell and invest and educate themselves and challenge existing authority structures, then you're not going to get things like Silicon Valley and technological development and so forth. And, I think that's just a belief. I don't know whether it's true or not. There are reasons for thinking it's true, but China has really challenged that because they've mastered many forms of modern technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning and so forth, despite the fact that they are an authoritarian regime. Now, I would say that there are big vulnerabilities in the Chinese economic model. They're still very heavily dependent and become more dependent over time on state-owned enterprises, which are the least efficient uh, capitalist. Well, they're not capitalists. They're basically a kind of state capitalist organizations. And there's reasons to think that that model is not going to sustain itself over a prolonged period of time. But that's an empirical question, and we'll just have to see how that works out, because I'm not going to stand in front of you and say, I know that in 20 years that whole Chinese system is going to break down and it's not going to work, because I can't see that well into the future.
Yes, thank you. So Professor Mikhail Alexeyev here, San Diego State University, and has a follow-up question, putting the China question into more geopolitical, even military context, and asking a polarization. And let me ask this provocative question, literally. In the emerging system competition between liberal democratic market model, mainly Euro-Atlantic coalition, and the autocratic model, mainly Eurasia, what kind of signposts in the next coming years would indicate that one or the other system is likely to prevail? Would this competition build up to a global war in the near future?
Well, I don't think that you're going to get a polarization of global politics that is comparable to the one that existed during the Cold War. I mean, China and Russia have been cooperating with one another, but I don't think they actually have enough in common that that's going to be a durable source of alliance. But I don't think you need that to realize that the world is actually a very dangerous place. I mean, Chinese foreign policy had been quite restrained up until 2013. Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successors all emphasized that they wanted to focus on building the domestic Chinese economy and were not trying to export their model. And that has really changed very substantially under Xi Jinping. And I must say, just in the last year, China has gotten much, much more aggressive in a whole range of activities in the South China Sea, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with its pushback. I mean, latest thing was sanctioning individual members of the European Parliament, which is something we've not seen before. And I think the single biggest flashpoint is going to be Taiwan, because Xi Jinping said very, very clearly that Taiwan was going to return to China in the next decade. And he said this in a speech 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago. So we're already 2 years into that 10-year promise. And I do think that it's one of those legacies that he wants to leave, which is the reincorporation. He's now reincorporated Hong Kong, and I think he wants to do this for Taiwan. And that obviously puts the United States, Japan, other democratic countries in a very big bind, because I don't think anybody wants a war with China. But we have to face, the question of what do we do if it doesn't become just a matter of political and economic pressure, but actually military pressure. And that is one of the big, foreign policy challenges that we need to deal with right now.
Thank you. And there is one question about, in fact, several questions about the role of religion. And as you know, for some period of time, religion and nationalism were competitors in Europe, in Middle East, elsewhere, Islamist group, nationalist group. But we see recently emergence under the rubric of populism, right-wing populism. So how do you see the role of religion and then the combination of religion and nationalism? Do you think that they will go together as allies for a long time, ethno-nationalism and religious movements?
It's very difficult to generalize about this. I mean, there are certain countries where that alliance has happened. But when you talk about religion, there's still a great diversity of religious attitudes. And so there's a lot that's been made of the alliance between American evangelical Christians and the Republican Party, and Donald Trump in particular. But it's also the case that there's a very strong African American Black church that has been an important source of democratic motivation and mobilization. So I think you have to be a little bit careful from overgeneralizing. I think that there's a discussion that has, I think, begun in some conservative Christian circles about whether this jumping on board the Trump train was actually that healthy a thing for Christianity as such, because it's also stimulated a lot of anti-Christian sentiment on the other side. So I think that the outcome of this is not predetermined in advance.
Thank you. And Professor Ferid Abdunur from San Diego State, his question is the following. You spoke of how those who are drawn to populist right-wing movements are also reacting to being looked down upon and their need for dignity and respect. That's understandable, but what if a group of people's sense of their own dignity and respect is tied closely to certain privileges and they think they are due to them? How can one challenge their privilege without giving them the sense that their dignity is being challenged?
Well, this is why I think that liberalism is actually a good idea, because underlying classical liberalism is a kind of belief in human equality, and the belief that basically citizens need to be treated equally. And therefore, in the civil rights movement, the initial civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, there was an ideal of having a colorblind society in which African Americans would be treated no differently from white people. With the rise of identity politics on both the left and the right, you've had people moving away from that. And when you begin emphasizing identity groups and groups that require recognition of their dignity, you begin to move into, so some of that is necessary. It's a form of mobilization to push back against injustice and marginalization, but it also tends to lead to, um, a kind of an assertion of, superiority. This is what's happened with all nationalisms, because all nationalisms start out as a desire to be treated equally as other nations, but then quickly veers off into, into a kind of more aggressive stance. And so this is why I think that sticking with liberal principles of treating people as individuals and wanting to see them as individuals remains an important principle, and why group recognition, is inevitable in many cases, because groups actually do have corporate interests that need to be addressed on a group level. But it's something that, I think becomes problematic in a liberal democracy.
Thank you very much. So there are many questions. I read all of them and try to ask the most feasible one to Professor Fukuyama. And we already take too much time of you. I would like to end a single question about ideology. Because as you presented, right-wing populism in Turkey, in Hungary, in Russia, even perhaps in the United States, is based on certain sentiments, resentment, and has a very deep psychological dimension. But what about a consistent ideology that Marxism or others with certain ideologues provided for a long-term impact and permanency? Do you see such possibility in the future of right-wing populism as an ideological and theoretical challenge to liberalism?
That's a very good question. I actually think that it hasn't happened yet, and there are reasons for thinking that you're not going to get a consistent ideology out of this right-wing movement. And people have been searching for this, left and right. Vladimir Putin, for example, has wanted to try to describe what he's up to in ideological terms. And so he came up with these ideas like sovereign democracy, and now he sees himself as a kind of leader of an anti-liberal movement that connects himself with the national rally in France and with Donald Trump and so forth. But there isn't a kind of consistent thought. And part of the problem is that, it's just with the idea of nationalism itself, because nationalism is not a universalistic ideology, and it differs, So in some countries it is based on ethnicity, in other countries it's based on religion, and it's very much rooted in the specific historical experiences. And so I kind of doubt that there's going to be an overarching intellectual framework that's going to unite all of these different movements. I think they'll cooperate and give each other help the way Russia has been helping some of these right-wing groups, but I don't think it's ever going to emerge as something as distinctive as, let's say, Marxism, Leninism, with a full-blown theory and ideology behind it.
So on behalf of San Diego State University and all the organizers, I'm thankful to you, Professor Fukuyama, for your insightful talk and excellent answers to the questions. And I'm thankful to all of the audience coming all around the world, Indonesia, India, Turkey, UK, and of course, United States, and all the SDSU faculty and staff members who have made this event possible. And hope to see you next year in other events. Thank you, Professor Fukuyama,
Okay.
and have a good one.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye to everyone.